Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me on this webinar titled Empower Yourself, How to Advocate for EV Charging in Your Community. My name is Mel, Program and Policy Coordinator for Green Energy Consumers Alliance, and I'm really excited you were able to join me for today's webinar. It is 2 p.m. and we still have more people registered than I see in the attendees here right now. So we'll give folks a couple more minutes to log on before we get started. But as we wait, I will just go through some webinar logistics. Everyone is muted to avoid background noise, but I do want to be able to interact with you as much as possible in this format. So feel free to use the questions box to send questions to me throughout the webinar. Usually when I host these events, I like to answer questions as we go. But in this case, I think I'll be answering a lot of questions as I get through the slides. So in this case, we'll save Q&A for the end. And I don't have as many slides as usual, so hopefully we'll have plenty of time for that. And then finally, the last thing is the webinar is being recorded and will be shared after the fact. And any resources that I include as a screenshot, anything I mention will also be shared after the webinar, as well as the slides themselves. So don't worry about taking notes, just listen, pay attention, and you'll be able to get all the resources that I talk about after the fact. So it is 2:02, so I'll go ahead and get started. It says, my GoToWebinar sound test works, but I'm not hearing the speaker at all. Is anyone else having trouble hearing me? Let's test here. Apologies if you can hear me. I just want to make sure that the audio is okay before I continue to chat. Oh, great. Okay. To the person that reached out and said that their audio isn't working, I would suggest maybe leaving and re-entering the webinar, and that might be helpful. But it does seem like at least one other person can hear me, so I don't think it's an issue on my end. Apologies for that technical issue. And thank you to the person who said that they could hear me loud and clear. That was really helpful. So as I mentioned, I am a program and policy coordinator for Green Energy Consumers Alliance, which is a nonprofit organization based in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. And our mission is to harness the power of energy consumers to speed the transition to a low carbon future. If you've known us for a long time, you know that we accomplish that mission in two ways. The first is we develop and administer programs to help people access clean energy technologies and options more easily. The program that I tend to work on the most is called our DriveGreen program, which since 2016 has helped consumers be able to choose electric vehicles over gas-powered cars by offering educational resources, as well as being able to create a network of dealerships in Massachusetts and Rhode Island that offer electric cars at a discount. We know that the upfront purchase price of vehicles is a major barrier for lots of folks to be able to go electric and decrease their carbon footprint, as well as access those benefits of driving on electricity, namely lower cost of ownership, lower maintenance costs, and a more pleasant driving experience. And so our program is really geared towards helping people being able to make that choice. In addition to our programmatic work through DriveGreen, we also advocate for policies at the state level that help address some of the barriers that our programs are bridging the gap towards. So for example, we advocate for more charging infrastructure. For a long time, we've advocated for the expansion and introduction of a state EV purchase rebate so that we have more support for drivers who are going to go electric. and lots of other policies and programs to make it easier for folks to switch to an electric car. And in addition to our work with DriveGreen, we also have several other clean energy programs that can help you access green energy more affordably for your community. So if you're new to us and want to learn more about our work, I encourage you to visit our website to see the breadth of all the work that we do. And I want to start off today's webinar just with a little bit of grounding and something that's been on my mind quite a bit over the last couple of weeks, which is the tremendous amount of climate-related disasters that the U.S. has been experiencing, from the wildfires out west to the stronger hurricane season that we have seen in the Gulf, also impacting the East Coast as well. And, you know, in addition to all of those really plain examples of the way that climate change is affecting our daily lives, we also saw the IPCC report released by the United Nations back a couple of weeks ago, saying that climate action needs to be faster, more advanced, and larger than we had been doing, and also that the worst is yet to come, but we can still avoid the very worst of climate change by acting quickly. This has been on my mind a lot because I know that in response to big news like this, people often feel lost and aren't sure what to do next. And so I'm hoping that this webinar inspires a little bit of hope that there is something that folks can do in order to advance the accessibility of EV charging in their communities so that it's easier to decrease climate warming emissions on the scale that we need. So thank you for joining me today, and I hope the information that I'll share today is useful. And I'll also mention that the DriveGreen website that Green Energy Consumers has put together is a great resource for everything that you might need to know about electric cars related to the models that are available, as well as more logistical questions about how to charge, what level of maintenance is required, and just all the electric vehicle 101 type of information that might be helpful for you as we talk about the content in this webinar. So be sure to give our website a look if you haven't. Now, kind of into the meat and potatoes of this webinar. A couple of weeks ago, I hosted a panel-style webinar called The Value of Installing EV Charging at Apartments and Condos. And in that webinar, I had two EV charging experts and panelists talk about the different opportunities, barriers, and solutions that folks who live in apartments and condos might need to start thinking about if you want to install EV charging. So our panelists were Christopher Coy, who's in the bottom left there, from National Grid. He helps develop and run the EV charging programs at the utility, as well as Andrew Clark, who's in the top right of your screen there, who is a EV charging expert at Revision Energy, which installs EV charging among other clean energy offerings. And so we do have that entire webinar on YouTube, and I see that as the precursor of what this webinar is talking about. So in that last one, we talked a lot about the considerations that an apartment manager or a condo association might need to start thinking about in order to move forward with an EV charging installation. But this webinar is really about being able to empower folks who live in apartments and condos to be able to get to that step. So before you have a conversation with your condo association or your property manager, you need to have a game plan to make sure that you're prepared to have that conversation, and also so that you're more likely to be successful, so that you can encourage the folks around you, your neighbors, and the decision makers for your community to be able to install EV charging. So that'll be the focus for today. And at the beginning of that webinar, as well as at the beginning of this one, I just want to say that apartments and condos come in all different kinds of shapes and sizes. And part of the difficulty with installing EV charging in apartments and condos is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. So the type of charging that you might see for a multi-use office apartment building with unassigned parking is really different from the charging solution that might work best for an apartment building that has assigned parking or is managed by an individual landlord rather than a large property management company. So I just want to emphasize that I know that the advice that I talk about today might not suit every single person or work best for you, but I will try to cover as much ground as possible so that you get some useful advice and figure out some next steps for what's best for your community. And I also want to mention that if you do not park in a parking lot, so you park on the street or you have some other type of arrangement because you live in a city where parking is scarce, that doesn't disqualify you from owning an EV. It's absolutely really convenient to be able to charge at home and to be able to advocate for some sort of solution so that you and your neighbors can charge where you live. But there are plenty of folks who are able to own an electric car by taking advantage of the charging that's around town. So either right-of-way charging that's installed along parking spaces, which is something that folks in National Grid territory are very likely to look forward to in the coming years, or just being able to take advantage of destination charging, which is charging stations that are public and open for anyone to use at places like grocery stores, gyms, and other places that you might go to throughout your day. So just want to make sure that people are aware there is a way to own an EV if you can't charge at home. And in fact, one of our EV ambassadors at DriveGreen, someone who is able to purchase an electric car through our program, as well as educate other folks about his experience and talk about what it was like for him to make the decision to buy an electric car. His name is Xavier, and he was able to buy an electric car and charge it just by using the chargers that were in his community. So obviously, installing charging at a condo and apartment is the ideal situation, but don't let it hold you back if you're thinking about getting an electric car and don't want to wait for your apartment manager or condo association to catch up. So if you're here today, you probably are already somewhat aware of the difficulty of installing a charging station at a condo or an apartment. Here at DriveGreen, we're very aware of the fact that the majority of EV owners that have been able to get an electric car through our program have done so because they have an easy place to charge at home. So that means it was easy for them to upgrade an electrical outlet to 240 volts and just install their own charging unit because they own their own home, they have agency over the electrical infrastructure in their own home, and it's not that expensive. It usually costs about $1,200 to install a charging unit in a single family home, but that's not the case with condos and apartments. In condos, folks usually have trouble installing charging because even though you own your own unit, the electrical infrastructure that supplies electricity to your unit is shared amongst lots of people. So even if you have your own garage, it might be difficult to make the upgrades that are necessary to be able to install a charging unit because there's some larger work that needs to be done. And it may be difficult to get other people on board to make that investment so that you can install charging. If you do live in a condo and you have shared parking, then that makes it even harder because then you have questions of, who owns the charging stations, how much do you pay for them, and who's responsible for paying for installing them. So really quickly you start to snag into questions like that. And apartments can be difficult also because you don't own where you live, and so folks are less willing to make investments to install charging infrastructure because it's an investment that you'll likely lose once you move out of that apartment. And you also have less leverage as well as an apartment dweller because you don't own the property, and so the landlord or property manager may not want to hear what you have to say as much compared to someone who owns the unit. So those are the barriers, and through talking to a lot of people that have been able to either convince their condo association or property manager that charging is a good investment, or just folks that have tried to go through the process and stumbled, I've kind of spoken to a lot of those folks and drawn the overarching patterns or conclusions that kind of creates a roadmap so that if you're in a situation where you're trying to convince your decision makers or your neighbors that EV charging is a good thing to do, then there's a kind of game plan that you can follow. And I'll go into each of these in more detail as we go on, but here's the high level overview. And you can kind of think of it as a funnel, right? Which is why I have that triangle on the screen there, is you can start at the very top, and that's an easy entry point for a lot of people. And you might not make it all the way to the bottom to be able to install charging stations, but it is a worthwhile investment of time and energy anyway, because the more people that you can talk to about how important EV charging is, and the more you get the conversation started, then it'll be easier to jump on opportunities as they arise. And I'll talk about what I mean by that in a little bit. But the first thing that anyone can do, regardless of what your situation has been with charging and what barriers you have, is to make the case that electric vehicles are something that people should be knowing about. So through my experience talking to folks with the DriveGreen program, it's clear that not everyone knows what an electric vehicle is. Unless you're plugged in to the conversation already, you might not know any models that are available besides Tesla. You might not know the benefits of electric cars. You might not know that they cost less to operate. You might not know how likely it is that that's how the majority of people are going to be purchasing their cars in the coming decades. And you might not know what the climate goals are in the state. And so lots of people are just unaware of the fact that electric vehicles require charging infrastructure, and that apartments and condos are a really important stakeholder to be able to increase accessibility for electric cars. So that's a really important starting point of the conversation, because if you don't know the first thing about electric cars, then it gets harder and harder to make the case for why it should be the responsibility of a property manager or condo association to install the charging. So once you get past that point of, you know, the basics of electric cars, then there's the question of consideration. Why is this the responsibility of the condo association and property manager? Why is this something that they should start thinking about now? You know, it's true that in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, there is a very small percentage of electric cars on the roads today. And so it can be easy to think that charging infrastructure is a problem for a couple of years from now, or, you know, if you're a property manager, if you're not hearing that people want electric car charging stations, then it might not seem like a priority for you, right? So after you kind of go through the basics of electric cars, the second point you want to make is why this is a conversation to be having now. Third, I should say, once you get people on board that yes, electric cars are coming, this is something that is important for property managers and condo associations to start thinking about. Very often people run into the problem of paralysis, because it seems like there are lots of barriers and questions to ask, and it can be difficult to find the answers to those questions. So very quickly you come up into the logistical difficulties of who's going to be paying for the stations, how much will it cost, will it work if people have shared parking or assigned parking, you know, the kind of nitty-gritty problems that come up and can quickly end the conversation about why EV charging is important, because if you don't know the answers to those questions, then it can fall apart. And specifically, one thing that comes up a lot is, you know, who's going to be responsible for doing the planning, right? Where do you go for help? And then finally, the last stage, once you create a plan to be able to address some of those barriers, which for the most part, they're surmountable, is the implementation. So how do you actually go from the planning process to making something happen? And there is support for each one of these sections. So no matter where you are in the stage of conversation, Green Energy Consumers Alliance, as well as some of our allies and experts at National Grid, and also charging station installers, can help you work through these things. And especially if you're in the planning and implementation portion, I would encourage you to go watch that webinar that I mentioned at the beginning of today's webinar, so that you can hear directly from the experts about their experience on that. But starting from the top, at the very top of the funnel, one of the first things that is really important if you live in a community and you want to be able to install charging stations for yourself and potentially shared ones for others is whether your neighbors are also interested in electric cars. So if you don't talk to your neighbors, you'll have no idea as to whether lots of people are thinking about electric cars and are also paralyzed by the fact that there's no charging, or maybe folks aren't considering it, and this is an opportunity to share the benefits and the resources about electric cars that are making you interested in an electric car in the first place. So you can do this in a variety of ways, and we've seen this be really effective in particularly areas that have community or shared events. So you can talk to your neighbors and share events that are related to electric cars to invite them to consider it. You can distribute information on a newsletter, or perhaps if your community does shared events, you can get on the board of a condo association meeting and try to put it on the agenda. Or you can do a plain old-fashioned survey and talk to people and see, is there anyone else who's interested in this? Because the more people that are thinking about an electric car and maybe would move forward if there was charging, the better case that you have in making sure that there's energy and agreement behind this. And if you don't have any allies at all, that's also just good information to have. The key thing to remember here is that I think the average person gets a new car every 6 to 10 years. And so, if you think about the scale of when you might be thinking of a new car, that's a lot of time. And, it's impossible in a large complex or, even a row of townhouses that everyone will be making that decision at the same time. And so to the extent that you can catch people, as they're thinking about their next car is slim, but that education work is important nonetheless. So, yeah, it's a great strategy to just be able to talk to your neighbors. And then once you do talk to them, you can kind of assess how interested they might be and be able to share those educational resources that you have. This doesn't necessarily have to be about, this is why we need charging stations and here's what our plan is. It can just be about, information about electric cars so that you can kind of start the conversation, not a sales pitch, but just information. And I do want to say this component is really important because, I work for a nonprofit and do this kind of educational work all the time. But I don't necessarily have a personal relationship or connection to every person that I talk to, whereas you in your community have an advantage over, other folks that might be interested in supporting electric cars because you have an investment in the community. So definitely use that to your advantage. And lots of people have been successful using that kind of strategy. And, I know it may seem like a lot to have to organize educational events and kind of spread resources, but there are multiple levels of engagement to make it easy to fit into, whatever your capacity is, whether you're ready to, start talking to your neighbors and see whether you can get electric car charging installed ASAP, or whether you just want to share information and kind of be a do-gooder by spreading awareness about electric cars, because it is that first step to be able to get charging in your community. So I have listed here a couple of really easy actions, which is, joining the DriveGreen Facebook group. It's a community group where EV owners and potential EV owners get together to share information and knowledge. And so it's a great place to ask questions, but also to start to speak to other EV drivers. The other thing that you can encourage people to do is sign the My Next Car Will Be Electric pledge. And that'll actually subscribe you to a quarterly newsletter that gets you information that might be relevant to engaging your neighbors. So you'll get updated on events that Green Energy Consumers hosts, or new car models that are coming out, or exciting new policy proposals that will expand public charging, basically anything that you might need to know if you're thinking about getting an electric car, but you're not there yet. And so things kind of scale up from there. But we at Green Energy Consumers have seen, community members get together with their neighbors to be able to advocate as a unit as well. So that might be an opportunity for your condo association or your property manager, but it also might just be a way for you to connect to other people in your community to see what else is being done and whether that could potentially help provide you leverage and information so that you come into conversations with your neighbors being better prepared. And I know it sounds kind of hokey, you know, like we just need to educate more folks and that will get the ball rolling. But it is effective. And I've seen this work in multiple different instances, including in the apartment building that I happen to live in. The photo that you see there is my electric car charging at a set of shared stations installed at a large apartment complex in Providence. And I actually spoke to the property manager to ask, you know, why these stations were installed in the first place and whether it came from tenants voicing support or some other thing. And he had shared that the reason that they decided to move forward with the charging stations is because an office tenant had found an incentive program to help pay for the stations. So in this case, it was a matter of direct advocacy from a tenant who wanted to see EV charging and was able to share relevant information to the property manager so that they could jump on it when the opportunity arose. I want to make it clear that in Massachusetts, the incentives to install charging at residential buildings is very likely to increase over the next year because the utility companies, National Grid and Eversource, are both proposing charging programs to be able to support charging installations much better. And so on this next screen here, I have a summary of the incentives that are available to folks that live in multi-unit homes that you might be able to take advantage of. And so, you know, your advocacy at your community could just be sharing what incentives are available and how property owners can take advantage of them. Because ultimately, you know, folks want to be able to receive things at good cost, at good value. And so if you show that there's opportunity to install charging at minimal cost or in some cases for free, then that is a really compelling case regardless of, you know, what folks think about electric cars and how aware they are of their benefits. So definitely be on the lookout for that, and there are going to be more opportunities to have multi-unit properties install charging at low cost. Okay, so far I've talked a lot about the educational piece of how you can get the conversation started and what you might be able to share to make a difference in whether charging is on the agenda. But once you kind of get to that point, the reason that apartments and condos can be difficult to install charging at is because it's logistically difficult, right? So questions might come up like who's paying for the cost of installation, who's in charge of the project, like who is responsible for hiring someone and making sure that the work is done properly. How are you going to manage charging if there are assigned parking spots? Is every single person going to need to get their own charging port, or is there a way for people to share them? Who's going to pay for the cost of electricity? How can you meter this? I mean, the questions just go on, and those are all really good, important questions. So the thing that I would recommend is to emphasize to any folks that have these kinds of questions is that a lot of these barriers are surmountable. And there are two resources that I can point you to help to create a plan. The first is Green Energy Consumers Alliance's new guide called Empower Your Tenants with EV Charging. And it is a very broad overview of some of the questions that apartment managers and condo associations might have in this process. And it lists some options. So for example, if the question is, who is going to pay for the electricity that is being dispensed at charging stations? The good news is there are multiple options for that, and any one of those options might be better or worse fit depending on your exact unit. So we don't give advice or make suggestions. We just kind of say, here's what is available and here are the different ways that you can address this issue. But the best way really to get the advice that you need in creating a site plan and making sure that the charging station plan that you have makes sense, not just for now, but for the next 5, 10, 15 years for that property, is to be able to talk to an experienced charging installer or vendor. So that person is someone who actually goes, looks at the property, looks at your electrical infrastructure, and makes recommendations on how to install a charging unit at the lowest possible cost, and also so that it serves the need that is identified by the community. And so with those two resources together, you'll be able to create a plan that works for you. And I'll be able to share this guide after the webinar is over. But just as an example of, the kinds of information that we have in there as well, one other question that you might have is, what's level 1 versus level 2 charging, and how do I know what is best for, the parking space that I'm looking at or the parking lot that I'm looking at? So we kind of break that down for you and make it easy so that even someone who is not an EV charging expert, someone that hasn't had the experience of charging at level 1 or level 2 speeds, can start to work through the decision of what might be best appropriate for that property. And in terms of being able to find someone that can provide that advice, there are plenty of organizations that do the installing that can start to help you work through some of those questions. So if you are, seriously considering an EV charging installation and, want to take advantage of the incentives that are out there and you think it might be a good fit, then the first person that you should talk to is a qualified installer. As I mentioned, the utility companies, Eversource and National Grid, have lots of incentives to be able to install charging stations at low cost for the people that own the property. And so alongside that, they have information about who is qualified to do this work and who they might recommend. So if you're looking at the incentives, then alongside that, you should be looking at the installers who can help you wade through some of those questions. One thing that I want to make clear is that the importance about having a charging plan is that it makes it easy to take action once there is an opportunity available. And what I mean by that is it can take upwards of 2 years to install a charging station from, the beginning, yes, I want to make a plan, let's do this, to the charging stations are in the ground and ready to dispense electricity. Just because if you're running cables long distances underground, it can involve trenching. For large buildings and parking garages, it can involve breaking down walls and running new wiring. The process can be time-consuming and laborious and expensive. And so if you have a plan to install a charging station, or at least it's on the radar of the community to install charging stations, then you can have a longer scope of time to be able to find when the right time to move on the installation is. So I recently spoke to a person who lives in a condo association, or in a condo, and the association is planning on repaving their parking lot in the spring. That is a prime trigger opportunity to think, okay, is this a good time to be able to install new electrical infrastructure? Because we're already going to be ripping up the concrete and asphalt that makes the charging installation expensive. So, is there a way to reduce costs by acting on the installation during an opportune time? So those are the kinds of triggers that I'm talking about. Another trigger might be the utility programs that are coming out, hopefully in the next year. If you know that those incentives are coming and that you might be able to take advantage of them when they're available, then having a plan in the interim just makes it that much more likely that you'll be able to access that funding once it comes through. And this is important because especially for multi-unit dwellings and workplaces and offices, that money can go really quick and typically goes to the entities that are best organized. And so if you know it's coming, now is a great time to start planning. Yeah, and then I guess the other trigger that you might be thinking about in terms of how to get the conversation started is if you are able to talk to your neighbors and you identify that there's a large group of people that, you know, is thinking about getting an electric car but isn't sure how they would charge, then that can be a trigger in and of itself, right? If you talk to your neighbors and see that there's demand for this, even if people aren't going to get an electric car right that day or that weekend, then that can be a good way to have leverage to start the conversation. So I've been talking for a long time, and I appreciate you bearing with me as I go through this information. But I just wanted to take some time to be able to look at some of the great questions that I received at the last webinar related to different scenarios that you might see if you're thinking about installing charging. And, you know, I got, I think, over 180 people RSVP'd to that webinar. And I got so much information about different scenarios. And, you know, I live in a large building and we have this issue, and I live in a small building and we have that issue. And, you know, there's all different kinds of problems you might face, but there's also some commonalities between the different situations. So I'll just be going through a couple of the questions that I got from that last webinar, and I'm hoping that some of this might be helpful if you are in a similar position. Of course, there's no one size fits all, but at least you can kind of get a sense of what other people are asking and whether it's relevant to you. So the first question is, for large developments with over 100 cars, does anyone offer assistance in designing and envisioning electric vehicle supply equipment, that's EVSE, for lots of vehicles simultaneously? What would that look like? Yes, so as I mentioned, those EV charging vendors are specialists in exactly that. So if you live in a single family home, you don't really need a specialist to design your charging installation. You just need an electrician to upgrade your outlet, and then you basically plug in the unit and then you're done. But for large developments, you know, there's a lot more considerations that you might want to think about. So for example, where you place your station in a parking lot can dramatically affect what the installation costs are, because the closer that the charging stations are to the source of electricity, then the less wiring you have to run and the less expensive it'll be. So the charging vendor installation, or the charging installers that I mentioned previously, have exactly that kind of expertise where they can come visit your site and kind of see what the issues are and what the lowest cost option would be for you. And so you can start that conversation without necessarily making a commitment to, you know, go and use their services, but it's just a way to kind of start that conversation. And I recommend, you know, maybe talking to a few and getting a couple of quotes so that you can see what your options are. But yes, those services do exist and they're very helpful. The next question is, electric vehicle technology is evolving rapidly and dramatically. In regard to long-term planning, how future-proof do you think today's implementation is? And for that matter, is today's implementation likely to be considerable overkill for the future? So this question gets at a fundamental difficulty with apartments and condos, specifically large apartments and condos, which is you might have 200 cars serving a parking lot or in a parking lot, but you don't necessarily want to install 200 charging stations because that would be overkill, right? But at the same time, you don't want to just install 2 charging stations here in 2021 and then have to go back and rip up all this infrastructure that you put in to be able to add more, let's say, in 5 or 6 years. So in regard to this kind of planning, the charging vendors will help you out a lot, but the utility also can be helpful in this. one of the proposals in the new charging programs that the utilities are offering is to offer site design support, so that if you do have a really large transformer and it would be expensive to upgrade, they can help you do some of that long-term planning, so that you have the infrastructure in the ground ready to go, but you don't have immediately 100 charging stations in the parking lot, because that would be excessive. So yes, there's ways to scale your investment so that it makes sense for the demand now, while also setting yourself up for success long term. And I happen to be of the opinion that, there's very little risk of installing too many, but the smartest thing to do is to just install the appropriate amount of chargers, while also making sure that the underground wires and cables are ready to go for more charging stations in the future. The next question is, I serve on the board of a 65-unit, 15-building townhouse condo with all owner-occupied units with a single assigned garage spot, plus a single outside unassigned spot per unit, all underground service. Help. Yeah, so this is a difficult situation because there are options, right? You have this assigned spot for each person in the garage, and then you also have unassigned spots outside. So this is a case where I would recommend speaking to a vendor directly and seeing if there's any significant cost differential between being able to install the charging in each individual garage versus outside spots. The other piece of information that might be helpful is to go all the way back to the beginning and talk to people and see what they would prefer, right? So if the desire for charging is something that a lot of people have, and some are already thinking about what might work best for them, then it's important to take that into consideration, because you do have those options. So yeah, I would just say more information is the important thing here, to be able to talk to an expert and figure out the plan that works best. But I would suspect, because it's a condo, it would be possible to upgrade the electrical infrastructure for folks going into their units. And then you can give each unit owner the option to make the upgrades themselves. So to do the work of a regular single family detached house and just install the charging unit, and kind of leave it to them on when the best opportunity for them might be. But again, it depends on what the neighbors are asking for and what the conversation has been like so far. And options are always good. And I kind of touched on this question a little bit earlier, but someone asked, is it possible to meter electricity use so each resident can pay their share of electricity costs? Yes. There is absolutely a way to make sure that the folks using the electricity are paying for the costs that they incur. There's a couple of ways of doing that. So the traditional way that we think about monitoring electricity consumption is with a meter, right? So each unit has a meter, and that meter says exactly how much electricity they used. And so whatever it says that they used for the month of August is the amount that they get billed for. And that is certainly an option for some folks, particularly in individual units that people own. But the other option is can potentially be useful, especially if you're talking about shared charging stations. And that's the possibility to have a smart Wi-Fi connected charging station that bills every resident automatically for whatever amount of electricity that they use. I happen to be an EV driver, and I use shared charging stations in the parking garage where I park my car, and the charging station bills me 20 cents per kilowatt hour that I consume with my car. So it's comparable to what I pay to keep the lights on in my home. But it's billed directly using the charging station. So I just scan the app on my phone with on the charging unit, and it is connected to an account that I have that's bills using my credit card. And so I'm able to pay for the electricity that way. So that's another option that some people aren't aware exists and can be really helpful, because it also takes the matter of billing out of the responsibility of the property manager, right? So that is done by the charging unit itself. And so you don't have to worry about being able to install a separate meter, which can cost much more money. And then the other option is, so I would say a drawback for having those smart Wi-Fi enabled charging stations is that they have networking costs. So there's an additional monthly fee because it's connected to Wi-Fi, and you have this service of the billing being taken care of. And so another option is to just ask that if you have shared stations, only folks that have electric cars can kind of pay some sort of monthly fee to be able to access the stations. So you can decide what a fair price for that fee would be. Let's say, I don't know, what would be reasonable? Like $80 a month, for example, to be able to charge, and so that those costs are recouped. And so it's just a matter of how flexible you're willing to be in order to cover those costs, and also what folks are willing to pay and how. So there are solutions that are a little bit of creative and can help you get at this, at those kinds of questions. And of course, if you are the person that's trying to install a charging station for your community, then kind of thinking through some of those questions and then making a proposal will make it much easier to have the conversation. So rather than saying to your property manager, I don't know how much I should pay, figure it out, if you offer a number that is based on how much you drive, or make an offer, then it can just be easier to start that conversation without putting the burden on the folks that are the decision makers. So try to do your homework and be as prepared as much as possible. And all of the resources that are listed here will help you do exactly that. So Green Energy Consumers has compiled a bunch of information that might be helpful as you start to have this conversation, so that you're prepared to basically help develop the plan, or at least show your decision makers that there are opportunities to help pay for the installation, or address whatever issues that they might have. And so I encourage you to kind of look through what we have here and see what might be most helpful for you, depending on what stage of the conversation that you're at. And then finally, I'm almost to the end of my slides, and we have about 10 minutes left. So if you have questions, now would be a good time to send them in. National Drive Electric Week is coming up. This is a really exciting time because Green Energy Consumers is offering all kinds of information and resources to be able to help you start to have that conversation with your neighbors if that's the stage that you're at. So you can invite folks to the events that we have coming up. You can just share the information that you learned, stick it in a newsletter, let people know that this is happening. And we have a mix of in-person, outdoor, and online events. So depending on your comfort level and whether you would want to see an electric car in person or just kind of hear about what options are available, we have plenty of events coming up to help you start that conversation. So I encourage you to check out what we have. And a few events are actually also wind turbine tours as well. So Green Energy Consumers, as I mentioned, has a bunch of programs. One of them is a program to green up the electricity supply for folks that choose to opt in. And we support locally generated wind power produced in Coventry, Rhode Island. So you can actually see the power that's being produced from the wind and look at the electric cars and kind of have all of those things click together to make the most sense, and to learn about clean power and also learn about electric cars and the people that drive them and what their experiences are like. So I encourage you to attend that. And that is the end of my presentation. So thank you so much for accepting all of that information. I know it was a lot. And I do have my email on the screen there. So if there is something that you feel like I can help you with directly, either a connection I can make or a question I can answer related to your exact property, then I'd be happy to try and help you as much as possible. This is a new area of expertise for Green Energy Consumers Alliance. And so we don't have any fully fledged programs like our DriveGreen program to be able to kind of walk you through the entire process, but I can connect you with whatever resources that I have that might be helpful. So please don't hesitate to email me if you have any questions related to the material that I have shared today. And I mentioned this at the beginning of the webinar, but everything will be shared via email. So look out for your inbox in the coming days, and you'll be able to receive the guide and all of the resources that I talked about today. I do see that one person raised their hand. I don't think I can unmute you if you have a question, but if you'd like to type that question into the question box, then I will be around to answer it. All right, I don't see any questions coming in, so feel free to just reach out to me via email if any come up. But thank you so much all for joining me today. And yeah, I hope this information will be helpful for you as you start to have the conversation about installing EV charging wherever you live. And best of luck. I know some people go through the process and come into a lot of barriers and end up not being able to make a lot of progress. But the conversation is definitely still worth having, and I encourage you to reach out if you can think of any ways that I can support you. All right, thank you so much for your time this afternoon, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.